The unforgiving wilderness had always demanded a price, extracting sanity and hope from those who dared to call it home. But for Silas, it had taken everything long before he arrived. This land, choked by winter's persistent grip, had been a canvas for his solitude, a desolate expanse where the vast, indifferent silence was only ever broken by the howl of the wind or the cracking of ice. He had come here, fleeing the ghosts of choices made and promises broken, seeking not peace but oblivion, a numbing cold that mirrored the one within his own hollowed-out chest. Yet, even in this self-imposed exile, the land had found a way to offer a new kind of torment, one wrapped in the ancient, glacial embrace of a forgotten past. What Silas unearthed that frigid afternoon would bind his fate to a story centuries old, shattering the fragile sanctuary of his isolation, and drawing him into a haunting descent where the lines between the living and the dead blurred into an unbearable truth. He merely sought to lose himself, but instead, he found another, and in doing so, found himself utterly, irrevocably lost. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The river, once a roaring artery of life, lay paralyzed beneath a skin of obsidian ice, its frozen surface mirroring the leaden sky. Silas, his frame gaunt beneath layers of worn canvas and wool, had been hacking at the river's edge, seeking a vein of ore, when his pickaxe struck something unyielding that was not rock. The sound had been dull, a muted thud against the endless scrape of his tools, yet it resonated with an unnatural weight. He knelt, his breath pluming in the frigid air, and meticulously chipped away at the ice, a strange, morbid curiosity overriding the exhaustion that perpetually clung to him. The translucent layer began to reveal a darker shape beneath, something too uniform, too distinct to be merely stone or a sunken log. A shadow, then an outline, slowly emerged from its crystalline tomb, preserving a form that was undeniably human. The ice, like a cruel artist, had captured every detail with chilling precision. The taut skin, stretched over prominent cheekbones, the hollowed eyes staring upwards, frozen in a silent, eternal scream. It was the face of a man, ancient and preserved, unmistakably a warrior. His braided hair woven with faded feathers, his hands clenched around the remains of a crude, yet finely crafted, hunting spear. A Shoshone. The world seemed to shrink around Silas, the vast emptiness of the wilderness suddenly pressing in, suffocating. He stared at the face, the eyes that had witnessed forgotten sunrises, the lips that had spoken a language lost to the wind, and felt a cold hand clench around his own heart, tighter than the ice that held the warrior in its thrall. It was an intrusion, a grotesque, beautiful trespass into his carefully constructed solitude. Silas stared at the warrior's face, a silent testament to a life ended abruptly, violently, centuries ago. The ice, a fickle guardian, had preserved not just flesh and bone, but a whisper of a spirit, a fragment of history that now confronted him with the stark reality of time's relentless passage. His initial shock slowly gave way to a peculiar fascination, a morbid reverence. The man, a mere echo of a long-dead civilization, held a dignity even in death, a stark contrast to the living, breathing decay that often clung to Silas himself. What did one do with such a discovery? The question hung heavy in the air, a question the unforgiving land offered no answer for. He could leave the body, let the ice reclaim its silent burden, but a strange compulsion, a sense of duty he hadn't known he possessed, gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the sheer humanity of the face, untouched by the ravages of common decay, a face that held a wisdom beyond understanding, a pain beyond measure. He picked up his tools again, not to search for gold, but to liberate this frozen sentinel. The work was grueling, each strike of the pickaxe sending jarring vibrations through his aching arms, but he persisted, driven by an unidentifiable force. Shards of ice flew, glinting like scattered diamonds in the weak sunlight, each chip revealing more of the warrior's frame, the intricate beadwork on his leather tunic, the sinew-wrapped handle of his spear. The temperature plummeted with the approaching dusk, turning his breath to mist, but the chill that truly permeated his bones was not from the cold, but from the unsettling proximity to such ancient, preserved death. As the last major piece of ice shattered, releasing the body with a wet thud onto the frozen earth, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh seemed to escape the air. A breath held for centuries now finally exhaled. The warrior lay before him, a stoic figure, his repose disturbingly lifelike, his eyes still fixed on the indifferent heavens. Silas knelt, his hand hovering, a tremor running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. The warrior lay, a silent, stark monument to a forgotten age, his dignity somehow intact despite the indignity of his millennia-long slumber in the ice. Silas, though weary to his bones, felt a peculiar weight settle upon him. Not just the physical strain of his task, but the immense, crushing weight of history itself. He couldn't leave him exposed to the scavengers, to the elements that had so ruthlessly claimed him once before. There was a sense of profound reverence that demanded more than just a quick glance and a turn of the back. It was a duty, a quiet, unspoken pact forged in the frozen silence. With arduous effort, he dragged the rigid body away from the river's edge, toward a patch of softer ground where the earth, though still frozen, promised a less arduous task than cracking through more bedrock. Each movement was deliberate, a silent conversation between the living and the long dead. He felt the cold seeping through his clothes, but his focus was singular, absorbed by the task of providing a measure of peace. Using his pickaxe and shovel, he dug a shallow grave, the ground protesting with each swing, a metallic clang echoing in the stillness. It was a primitive burial, unadorned by ceremony, yet imbued with a solemnity that transcended formal rites. He worked until sweat mingled with the dust and ice on his brow, until the last glimmers of twilight faded into the deep, bruised purple of the night sky. When the warrior was finally settled in the earth, covered by handfuls of frozen soil and loose stones, Silas stood over the makeshift mound, his shoulders slumped, the silence of the wilderness deepening around him. He felt an inexplicable pull, a lingering connection to the figure now hidden beneath the frost-hardened ground. It was as if a new occupant had moved into the desolate landscape of his mind, a silent sentinel who watched him even as he turned and slowly made his way back to his cabin. The small, desolate dwelling, usually a haven of grim solitude, now felt different, heavier, as if an invisible thread stretched from the fresh grave to its very foundations, taut with an unspoken question. The silence inside was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of an ancient gaze. The next morning, the sun rose, indifferent to the shift in Silas's world. The vast, indifferent wilderness stretched on, a familiar, brutal landscape, but the very air around his cabin seemed to hum with a subtle, unnerving energy. He tried to resume his routine, the monotonous rhythm of prospecting that usually dulled the incessant gnawing of his own past. But the image of the warrior's face, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, refused to recede. It was a brand on the inside of his eyelids, a constant, unsettling presence. He found himself staring into the embers of his fire, seeing not the flickering warmth, but the glacial blue of the warrior's preservation, the stark lines of his face. His hands, usually steady with the tools of his trade, felt clumsy, disconnected. A strange, insistent chill settled deep in his bones, colder than the outside air, as if a fragment of the ice that had held the warrior had somehow embedded itself within him. He would catch himself pausing, listening, convinced he heard a faint whisper carried on the wind, a rustle that wasn't merely the movement of dry leaves or the creak of old timber. Each shadow in his cabin seemed to deepen, to coalesce into ambiguous forms that stretched and distorted at the periphery of his vision. He knew it was the exhaustion, the isolation, the sheer weight of such an unexpected discovery pressing upon his already fragile mind. He told himself it was nothing more than the tricks of a lonely man's brain, that the wilderness was playing its usual, cruel games. Yet, the unease persisted, a low thrum beneath his skin, growing louder with each passing hour. He felt an inexplicable kinship with the warrior, a shared bond of isolation, perhaps even of loss. The warrior, lost to time, and Silas, lost to himself. He remembered fragmented images from his own life, faces he had disappointed, chances he had squandered, the cold, silent judgment of those he had left behind. The warrior's silent judgment, paradoxically, felt less condemning, more like a mirror reflecting his own profound, unspoken burdens. The stillness of the cabin became a heavy cloak, each creak and groan of the aged wood amplified, seeming to whisper the warrior's story, a story that felt disturbingly intertwined with his own. As the days crawled by, each one a slow, agonizing slide deeper into an unsettling reality, the phenomena intensified, shedding their guise of mere imagination. The whispers became clearer, though still indecipherable, like ancient wind chimes played on a breath too faint for human ears. Silas would see fleeting movements in the corners of his vision, shadows that shifted with impossible speed, coalescing into outlines that hinted at a human form, only to dissolve when he dared to turn his head. His attempts to rationalize them as tricks of the light or symptoms of his mounting exhaustion grew weaker, replaced by a cold, creeping certainty. The cold within his cabin was no longer merely the biting chill of winter. It was a localized, unnatural presence, often centered in the space directly opposite him, as if someone stood there, unseen but undeniably felt. One late afternoon, desperate for human contact, for a voice that wasn't his own echoing in the vast silence, Silas ventured towards a small, dilapidated trading post miles away. The journey was arduous, marked by a growing sense of dread, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He found Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled prospector known for his cynicism and deeply entrenched prejudices, hunched over a meager fire. Hemlock barely looked up, his eyes rheumy with age and suspicion. "Anything out there, Silas? Here, tell the spirits are restless this season. Them native souls always causing trouble, even after they're gone." His words were laced with a dismissive contempt, a callous disregard for the history and suffering embedded in the very ground they walked. Silas felt a surge of something akin to rage, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed for the silent warrior he had buried. He mumbled a non-committal answer, the unspoken contempt in Hemlock's voice echoing the broader societal biases that had swept through this land, crushing its original inhabitants under the weight of their own progress. The casual cruelty of Hemlock's words, juxtaposed with the profound, unsettling connection Silas felt to the warrior, deepened the chasm of his isolation. He realized then that no one would understand. No one could comprehend the silent, profound shift occurring within him. He left the trading post quickly, the weight of the old man's words, and the silent, ever-present gaze of the warrior, driving him back to the perceived safety of his solitary cabin. The wilderness seemed to watch his retreat, its silence now less indifferent, more expectant. The fifth day dawned, a slate-gray sky pressing down upon the landscape, mirroring the oppressive weight that had settled irrevocably upon Silas's mind. He had not slept in days. The mere thought of closing his eyes, a terrifying prospect, a surrender to the unseen forces that had begun to claim his reality. His body was a trembling ruin, fueled only by the raw, frantic energy of pure dread. His hands shook incessantly, making even the simplest task, like stirring his meager coffee, an impossible chore. He paced his small cabin, a caged animal, each circuit bringing him no closer to escape, only deeper into the labyrinth of his unraveling sanity. The whispers had stopped being subtle. They now coalesced into a low, mournful hum that vibrated in the very air, a resonant frequency that seemed to shake the foundations of his being. The shadowy figures were no longer confined to the periphery. They danced at the edge of his vision, forming and dissolving, their movements fluid and impossible. He caught glimpses of eyes, deep and knowing, that seemed to pierce through the veil of perception, straight into the cavern of his soul. It was the warrior, he knew it, not as a threat, but as a presence, an unrelenting demand for something Silas could not yet comprehend. He tried to leave, stuffing a few meager supplies into a pack, but as he reached for the latch on his door, an unseen hand seemed to push against it from the outside, an unyielding force that pinned him back. He stumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate bird. Trapped. He was trapped in this small, isolated dwelling with the deepening mystery of the warrior. He clawed at his hair, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the world around him beginning to spin. The familiar contours of his cabin warped, the shadows lengthening into grotesque caricatures, each creak of the wood sounding like a whispered word. He collapsed onto his cot, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to contain the tremors that convulsed his body. His eyes, raw and bloodshot, fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable, for the final dissolution of the barrier between life and what lay beyond. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with an ancient energy, the culmination of centuries of silence, now broken by an insistent, spectral plea. The face, the warrior's face, was all he could see, superimposed onto every surface, his hollow eyes burning into Silas's fevered consciousness, demanding recognition, demanding understanding. Sleep, when it finally claimed Silas, was not a release, but a violent plunge into the abyss. It was the kind of sleep that offered no rest, only a heightened, terrifying clarity, a dream so vivid it felt more real than the waking world he had just fled. He found himself standing not in his cabin, but on the frozen riverbed where he had found the warrior, the sun a distant, indifferent eye in the sky. The warrior stood before him, not as a frozen corpse, but as a living man, his skin the color of strong earth, his eyes the deep, piercing black of a mountain spring. He wore the same feathered braids, the same beadwork tunic, but now they shimmered with life, vibrant with the energy of a man fully alive, fully present. The warrior did not speak with words, but with a gaze that held the weight of centuries, a silent language that flowed directly into Silas's mind. He saw images, vast plains under an endless sky, the thunder of buffalo hooves, the warmth of a communal fire, the laughter of children echoing through a canvas village. He saw the cold betrayal of encroaching strangers, the relentless push of a civilization that saw only resources, not lives. He saw the warrior himself, defending his people, his land, his way of life, with a ferocity born of love and desperation. Then, the images shifted, accelerating into a terrifying cascade. The sudden ambush, the brutal struggle, the cold embrace of the river's icy grip, the final, desperate gasp, as the world dissolved into the silent, suffocating darkness. Silas felt the bite of the freezing water, the terror of drowning, the overwhelming despair of a life extinguished too soon, too violently. It was not merely a vision, it was an empathy, a profound, visceral sharing of the warrior's last moments. Then, the warrior's face, now impossibly close, filled Silas's entire field of vision. The eyes, no longer hollow, held a profound sorrow, a quiet plea. And Silas understood, with a crushing certainty that reached into the deepest marrow of his being, that the warrior's anguish was not for his own death, but for the desecration of his land, the erasure of his people, the betrayal of all that was sacred. He was not a vengeful spirit, but a lament, a symbol of a forgotten tragedy. The revelation hit Silas with the force of a physical blow, shattering the hardened shell of his own self-pity and forcing him to confront a grief far grander than his own. The dream ended abruptly, leaving Silas breathless, drenched in sweat, but, strangely, profoundly, awake. Silas awoke with a gasp, his lungs burning, his body convulsing not from fear, but from the residual shock of the dream, a profound visceral aftershock. The cabin was silent. The previous hum of unseen presences gone, replaced by an emptiness that felt vast and still, yet utterly transformed. The terror that had gnawed at him for days had receded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a melancholic ache that settled deep in his chest. He sat up, pushing the sweat-soaked hair from his face, his mind reeling from the vividness of the experience. It wasn't a nightmare. It was an awakening. The warrior's face, etched in his memory, no longer carried the grim stillness of death, but the vibrant, ancient wisdom of a man whose spirit had endured beyond the grave. The images from the dream replayed in his mind's eye, a tapestry of life, loss, and the enduring resilience of a people brutalized by history. He saw the raw beauty of the land before it was scarred by greed, the vibrant culture that had thrived here for millennia, and the tragic, inevitable clash with an unstoppable force. It was a truth delivered not in words, but in feeling, in raw, unfiltered emotion, a history imprinted directly onto his soul. His own life, with its petty grievances and self-imposed burdens, suddenly seemed insignificant, a mere shadow against the vast, sweeping tragedy he had just witnessed. The warrior was not a haunting, but a lesson, a poignant reminder of stewardship, of connection to the land, of the sanctity of life. The chill in the cabin remained, but it was no longer a chill of dread. It was the lingering coolness of ancient sorrow, a quiet echo of the warrior's perpetual mourning for his lost world. Silas looked at his hands, calloused and stained by the earth, and saw not just the marks of his own weary labor, but the phantom residue of the warrior's last moments, the fight, the cold. His perception of the world, and more importantly, of himself, had been irrevocably altered. The rigid, self-contained shell he had built around his heart had cracked, allowing a flood of raw, unfamiliar emotion to pour in. He was no longer just a man fleeing his past. He was a witness, a reluctant recipient of a story too vast and too heartbreaking to ignore. The warrior's silent lament had found its voice in Silas's shattered, receptive soul. The dream, a visceral revelation, had shattered the hardened shell Silas had meticulously built around his own despair, leaving him raw, exposed, and profoundly changed. The world outside his cabin, once merely a backdrop for his self-imposed penance, now vibrated with a new, somber significance. The land was not just rock and ice and trees. It was a living canvas steeped in history, bearing the scars of untold stories. The warrior, once an object of morbid curiosity and then of chilling dread, had become a profound presence, a silent ancient teacher whose lessons had burrowed deep into Silas's very being. The gnawing fear had dissipated entirely, replaced by a quiet, persistent ache of empathy and a sense of shared responsibility. He recognized the irony. He, a man who had sought oblivion, had found instead a purpose, albeit a somber one, in the ancient sorrow of another. His moral ambiguity, a comfortingly vague shroud he had worn for so long, had been ripped away, exposing a nascent desire for something akin to atonement. He thought of the shallow grave, the cold earth, the crude stones. It was not enough. The warrior deserved more than a hurried, anonymous burial by a desperate man. The impulse was not born of fear or obligation, but of a quiet, internal reverence. Silas spent the rest of the day in a contemplative silence, his mind no longer battling apparitions, but wrestling with the implications of the dream. The warrior's sorrow, a sorrow for his land and his people, resonated deeply with Silas's own unspoken burdens, the weight of his own missteps, and the lives he had inadvertently scarred. There was a kinship there, a shared understanding of loss. Though one was grand and historical, the other intensely personal. This commonality, strangely, brought a fragile thread of hope, a glimmer that perhaps even his own fractured spirit could find a measure of peace. The bitter cold of the wilderness still clung to the air, but the internal chill that had plagued him had begun to thaw, replaced by a strange, melancholic warmth. He had not found gold, nor had he found oblivion, but he had found a profound connection, a quiet imperative that demanded a quiet act of respect, a gesture of belated recognition for a life centuries past. The transformation was subtle, internal, but utterly foundational. The morning light, though still thin and cold, seemed to carry a different quality, a fragile promise of renewal in the vast, unforgiving expanse. Silas rose, his weariness replaced by a quiet resolve. The tremors were gone, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a somber clarity. He gathered his tools once more, but this time, his purpose was not for personal gain or self-preservation, but for an act of profound, belated respect. He made his way to the warrior's makeshift grave, the ground still frozen, but the connection between him and the earth beneath it vibrated with a renewed, almost sacred energy. He spent hours working, not just to deepen the grave, but to create a proper resting place, a cairn of stones meticulously placed, each one a silent prayer, a recognition of the life that had been. He spoke no words aloud, but in the silence, a torrent of unspoken apologies, of reverence, of a shared humanity flowed from his heart. He felt the weight of centuries of injustice, the echoes of a vibrant culture silenced by greed and ignorance. This small, solitary act felt woefully inadequate against such a vast historical canvas, yet it was all he could offer, a single drop in an ocean of sorrow. As the last stone was placed, Silas stood, his gaze lingering on the crude monument, a silent sentinel against the backdrop of the towering mountains. The air around him felt lighter, the profound chill that had permeated his being finally lifting, leaving behind a subtle, lingering sense of melancholy, a whisper of the warrior's enduring presence, now, peaceful, acknowledged. He wouldn't leave this place. Not yet. The wilderness, once a prison, had become a reluctant sanctuary, a place where he had confronted not just a ghost from the past, but the ghosts within himself. He would stay, perhaps to tend the land, to live a life imbued with the lessons learned, a life less driven by escape and more by quiet purpose. The scars on his own soul would remain, but the raw, festering wounds had begun to heal, tempered by the ancient sorrow and the unexpected gift of understanding. The warrior's face, once a source of terror, was now a quiet reminder, a guiding presence in the vast, silent stretches of his transformed existence. The ice had yielded a warrior, and in doing so, had forged a soul anew.